we'll begin the second talk of the day by Professor Souvik Mukherjee from CSSS in Calcutta. If I may formally introduce the speaker to you, Dr. Souvik Mukherjee is Associate Professor in Cultural Studies at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences in Calcutta. His research looks at video games as storytelling media through a broad spectrum of topics in game studies, ranging from postcolonialism, identity, and temporality in video games to video game cultures in Southeast Asia. He is the author of 3 monographs titled Video Games and Storytelling, Reading Games and Playing Books, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2015, Video Games and Postcolonialism, Empire Plays Back, published by Springer UK in 2017, and Video Games in the Indian Subcontinent, Development, Cultures and Representations, published by Bloomsbury in 2022, and is currently working on a book project on Indian board games and colonialism. His other interests are the digital humanities, post-structuralist theory, post-humanism, and early modern literature. His databases on the Dutch cemetery at Chinsura, the Scottish cemetery in Kolkata, and the 19th century Bengali industrialist Motilal Seal are all available open access. He is currently an elected board member of the Digital Games Research Association and a founder member of Dharti, the digital humanities group in India. He has been named a Digital Games Research Association Distinguished Scholar in 2019 and a Higher Education Video Game Alliance Fellow in 2022. He is also an affiliated Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Excellence Game Studies at the University of Tampere. With this, may I invite Professor Mukherjee for his talk.
Thank you for that extremely kind introduction, and of course, thank you for having me here, and very patiently kind of waiting to hear me talk. So I'm just gonna start off by saying that what I'm gonna talk about is a process too complicated to explain, P2C2E. I think I'm gonna say that I want to talk. This quote is from my favorite novel about video games, which is Harun and the Sea of Stories. I think Rushdie is just literally playing a video game in this novel, but we'll talk about Rushdie later. I'm Souvik. I research video games. So you got a longer introduction, but so my question was, why am I here? I was thinking yesterday when I was kind of writing up all this and kind of thinking, so why am I here? What am I doing here? And I felt like this chap in Friedrich's painting, which is like all like high art and all that, right? But then I feel more like this chap, which is who's kind of like almost standing in a similar way of Friedrich's painting, a romantic painting of the Wanderer of the Sea of Fog. But this is me playing Dark Souls 2, which I really suck at, but I always get killed. But I got to this level, you know, when I got to gaze on this kind of world outside, this sublime, and I'm doing that right now, actually. So I'm just like, why am I here? And I thought, I work on video games. Video games are not about writing, apparently not. Are they even literary? So why am I here? Video games are not Indian, quote unquote Indian. Actually, a colleague of mine, Adrian Shaw, wrote this essay, How Do You Say Gamer in Hindi? And she points out that there is no word for gamer in Indian languages. Like there is gemu in Japanese, they say gemu. And there are other, so are video games Indian? So I was thinking Indian writing in English. So also IWE often concerns itself with postcolonial thinking. And is there a postcolonial agenda? Are video games even aware of that? So all of that all said. And finally, 10 years back, there was an academic who said that I don't understand this video shidio media shidia. So I was like, video games worthy of academic attention, video studio, media studio, why am I here? So, okay, now, then I thought I am going to explain, I'm going to tell myself why I'm here. So I'll do that now. So this, by the way, is me. You know, the horse is mine as well, by the way. I've forgotten what I named the horse. I think it was Swallow or Feather or something. But this is me in Red Dead Redemption, again, like that Friedrich-like figure, and I'm looking at this vista, and this time I have a purpose, right? So I'll tell you what. So video games are a literary form, or certainly a literary form, in that players, sorry, there's a typo there, in that players read as they play. But with read, I'm using, can you hear me without the mic? There. You can. Wonderful. So, right. So the players read as they play. With read, I use a portmanteau word, a word which has a W in the read. That, right? You write and you read. That's thinking. Right. When you're reading, you're actually writing and reading and playing. So man, oh, wonderful. I feel like a rock star. Okay, so, right. So, Astrid Enslin actually, now what I'm saying here has been given more academic gravitas by Astrid Enslin, and she talks about literary gaming. And she says that, this kind of interacting with the digital artifacts combine the ludic and the literary. In other words, it looks at a hybrid subgroup of creative media that has both readerly and writerly. Sorry, she says playerly. I was thinking Barth. But yeah, readerly and playerly, readerly and writerly characteristics. Great. And in my own work, I look at the concept of supplementarity by Jacques Derrida, where Derrida is looking at how the center, and there is the supplement, the dangerous supplement, and Derrida says it is writing, and I say it is play. This play, and Derrida is always talking about play, really. So he also does say the same thing in a way. So I'm talking about the supplementarity of the narrative, ludic, and the machinic coming together. And basically, what I call my book, which the publisher didn't allow, so I used it as a subtitle, Reading Games and Playing Books. So you read games and you play books. Or you read books and you play games. Where you do the same thing all the way. So then I'm kind of making a case for video games as a narrative medium, or as a narrative media, rather, to recognize the plurality. Games are story-like. Stories may be game-like, right? I'm not saying that all games are stories. I mean, there is somebody who once said that Tetris is a great story because it is the story of the, the lives of overtasked Americans trying to clear their desks. That is, well, I'm not saying that, right? But nevertheless, games tell stories, and here you see me in this story of Red Dead Redemption, and not just one story, many stories, because I usually die in the game, and then I play it again, and I play it again, and then so many stories. So then the other point about video games not being Indian and the notion of localization. So one of the big things in video game development is localization. So you make a video game and you immediately have to localize it for kind of different groups because you have to sell it, right? Sell the game. And actually, Bernal Merino calls localization, very interestingly, a new area within translation studies. So already these connections with literary studies, translation studies coming in. And the whole thing is that it is about opening new markets, expanding franchises, but it is contingent on language, content, cultural, and technical issues. So the player experience has to be conveyed and tailored to the target territory. That is what localization is. But at the same time, the local is also the global, right? Because I'm sure many of you have heard this word chai tea. Whenever I go abroad and they say, do you want chai tea? I was like, what's chai tea? Chai tea is basically the local Indian tea made kind of global, the global and the local. So there is this theorist, Koichi Iwabuchi. He talks about something called mukokoseki, odorlessness. So when you buy sushi from Sushi Express, it doesn't smell. So the smell is taken out. The sushi is sushi, but it's not the Japanese sushi. It's a different kind of sushi, but it's sushi, and it's considered authentic. But there are obviously that's open to debate. So there is kind of all this complicated globalization happening in video games. And while we might not have a word for gamer in Indian languages, I mean, we have, again, gamer is part of the Indian languages lexicon, just like, let's say, cup and dish are, I guess. So there, it's like far more complicated. So, and I'm going to make that connection with IWE again. But so it works in multiple ways for video games. Indian video games are made with the global market in mind. And there is often this pressure to represent cultural elements, and it is heightened when these games travel abroad. But we must note that at the same time, Adrian Shaw is right in a sense, but at the same time, games are not kind of really an Indian medium. They come from different kind of location in globally, but they're also at the same time part of Indian culture. But that fact that they come from a different location is again kind of very importantly highlighted because of the algorithm. The algorithm, the way the games are designed, the way the game thinking is designed. Maybe that needs to change, but that's kind of there because Indian video games are themselves a localization of a Western software medium and of Western cultural modes. And I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of things. So this is complaints on the Steam platform against developers of Raji. Raji is this really popular Indian game which has been released during the COVID crisis, and it's, they kind of sort of sell themselves as representing Indian culture globally. But when they first made the game, they made, so this person writes, Hindi language, you are even providing Turkish language, but not including any of our Indian language as expected from our developers. Not complaining, but little disappointed to see Indian game developed by Indians and still not a single Indian regional language. That has been now rectified. They've got but when the game was initially released, they even made kind of the localization in Turkish, but not in Indian languages. Why? Because they thought they wouldn't sell. Anyway, but they've now kind of, so that's how the localization works. Again, similarly, if we do talk about kind of software becoming Indian, this one of my students pointed out this thing called bhai lang. And first of all, why just bhai lang anyway? Very sexist. But you see, hi bhai, bol bhai, hello world, bhai ye hai, a equals to something, bhai ye hai, whatever, and then jab tak bhai. So it's just basically it's very superficial. The coding, the algorithm is very Western. They've just kind of changed the parameters here. Sorry, not the parameters. They've just changed the kind of the commands basically. But the commands are actually the same. They perform the same function. So there is, like I said, it is a P2C2E, it is a complicated system. So there is kind of this push towards this global medium becoming kind of Indian, but at the same time, it is still kind of moving away. It has its kind of complex kind of associations where it is deeply kind of invested in kind of its Western origins. And of course, this is a thing that I come across quite regularly: video games and academic gravitas. And this is not just the person who said media shidia, video shidio to me, but the thing is, somebody of the kind of fame and importance as Roger Ebert, who's the late Roger Ebert now, but who's this who's this film critic, really eminent film critic. He said that video games can never be art. And why can they never be art? Because he says that no one out of the field has been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great poets, filmmakers, novelists, and poets. So he says the game, Bobby Fischer, Michael Jordan, they don't want to say that games are art. So let people who play games just play games. Let them not talk about art. And games are winnable. They have goals. Art doesn't have goals. So he gives a lot of kind of reasons, and he says that basically why aren't gamers content to play their games and simply enjoy themselves? They have my best blessing, not that they care. Um, Now, what Ebert gets wrong here, as do people who kind of dismiss games, um, uh, uh, is that these are not just games. They are the whole idea of the word game is kind of. I was talking to someone this morning here. I was saying the whole idea of the word game is kind of here. It takes an assumption of being non-serious. It takes an assumption of being childish. It takes an assumption of being not work, etc., etc. So these assumptions come into play. Whereas if you look at if you look at games in a much broader sense, then you see, like, let's say if you look at Hermann Hesse's novel, The Glass Bead Game, or even if you look at Hunger Games, or I could just give you so many other examples, then there is so much of story, there's so much of art that is kind of coming into play. And again, I use the pun on purpose. So actually, Professor Pramod Nair mentions in his book Digital Cool that computer games are, and I'm just paraphrasing, are probably the coolest kind of, and he uses the word cool. I'll just explain this how, but cool in the sense of flexible, cool in the sense of potential, coolest form of culture. And this is way back in 2011, 2012. But so now, of course, in the 2010s, you see the cordon sanitaire has broken down, and people, despite Ebert and others, there are big kind of art galleries which are now kind of showcasing games. And this one is MoMA, Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is a showcase of video games, basically. This is a showcase, an exhibition of video games, and this is a game called Somewhere, which I will talk about in a bit. But let me also let me also get this video playing while I talk. So this is again a kind of something called a discovery tour by this game Assassin's Creed, or and it's basically a recreation of ancient day Egypt, right? And you have historians, you have teachers, players, artists, all working to recreate Egypt. So, and again, this is in a sense, it's like a documentary, it's like art. At the same time, you have something which is more like modern art, surrealist art. This is Somewhere, which is a game I'll talk about later. So, all of these taken together, and with museums and kind of galleries, kind of presenting games. Actually, in the first slide, I showed a picture. I forgot to tell you, which is, it was basically two people watching and playing the game. Nobody knows for certain, by Afra Shafiq in the Dhaka Art Festival. So there is this question of gravitas. Thankfully, has kind of is less and less an issue now, because games, people are accepting that games are these interactive narratives that have a lot of currency, cultural currency, and cool, maybe digital cool. So so now, how do I connect Indian writing in English and games? And I was thinking, and in the introductory talk, your professors mentioned this fantastic website. I actually went to the website, and I was really benefited. So this is actually a quote that I got from the website, and this is by Amit Chaudhary. And Amit Chaudhary is actually saying that, he's actually kind of talking about the critics of the critics of the poet Arun Kolatkar. And the criticism here is that Kolatkar's poems don't relate to kind of Indian audiences. So Chaudhary says that defamiliarization not only renovates our perception of familiar territory in ways that the discussion on nationality not only cannot, but actually suppresses. So basically, this he looks at Kolatkar's poems written in English about a place called Jejuri, about a god Khandoba, but written in English. And the critics say here that these English poems don't relate to the people who actually go to worship Khandoba in Jejuri. But he says, Chaudhary says that this defamiliarization, the kind of presenting this in English in a different context renovates our perception of familiar territory, makes us think more again. What is it to visit Jejuri? What is it to, and in a way that just boiling this down to nationalist discussions will never be able to kind of make us ask these questions. It'll actually even suppress. Of course, I mean, writing really early on, KRS Iyengar says that Indian writing in English is but one of the voices in which India speaks. So basically, is as Indian as the literature in other kind of Indian languages. And thinking of this, I ought to think about this issue of authenticity, artificiality, and is kind of Indian writing. And I'm no expert, like I said. So Rajeshwari Sundarajan says that writing English in India has necessarily been an artificial production. But she uses artificial in the sense of deliberative and constructed, something that can be said of anything by software code as well. Software code, whatever software code creates, is also deliberative and constructed. It's constructed according to an algorithm, it's constructed according to certain logic. And Sundarajan says that Anglophone Indian fiction has a colonial genealogy that it cannot avow. But the new non-fiction is the product of a different formation, loosely called globalization, or glocalization perhaps, in which English has a more demotic dimension, a more people-friendly dimension, really. And she then directly refers to the internet and other online literature such as blogs. So Indian writing in English, as it stands now, in this globalized or glocalized kind of scenario, without kind of losing track of its kind of colonial genealogy, does actually connect to these kind of newer media. And I'm kind of left to speculate whether, just as it kind of talks about blogs and online literature, Indian writing in English, IWE, would not also include newer narrative media such as video games. Like IWE, Indian video games often also directly respond to colonialism. And this is something I'll talk about in a little bit. So, looking at all of these, and I also then noticed that some of the major writers of IWE, like Vikram Chandra, who writes, Vikram Chandra is actually an avid coder, and he writes about his coding experiences in his book Geek Sublime. And Salman Rushdie talks a lot about video games in his books Joseph Anton and Luca and the Fire of Life. So they connect their writing to writing code and playing games. So I'm now kind of speculating whether there could be a connection between IWE and Indian games, kind of in Indian video games. So I'll just do a quick survey of some of the games that I'll look at, and then come to my back to my framing kind of ideas. And this is a game called Raji. I spoke to you about this before. You can see the goddess Durga. She is one of the helpers of Raji, Durga and Vishnu. And Raji's brother has been kidnapped by demons, Rakshasas, and she is going to go and recapture. She's going to kind of rescue her brother from these demons. So this is, and you can see that this uses, basically Raji uses a lot of Indian art like Rajasthani architecture. Then there is the Tholuba Malatta puppetry traditions. Then they use kind of other, they use kolams and other kind of Indian art, and they use Indian mythology. So Anand Ramachandran, who was a journalist talking about Raji, says that in India, there is a virtually endless gold mine of gaming ideas. What we were waiting for is people with the skills to make world-class games. And nodding heads with Raji has shown that we are ready. So there is this whole idea of, are we ready to make like world-class games? Are Indian games going to be world-class? And this is this kind of chest-thumping moment. But my own observations are slightly different, because to me, playing Raji felt like playing Diablo 2, which was a hack and slash game from the early 2000s. The storylines are similar. In Diablo 2, the player character saves the world from demons, and the game involves hacking and slashing, and at numerous demons. Raji also falls under the same loose generic category of action adventure or dungeon crawler as Diablo 2. So it's kind of complicated. Like I said, it is not going to be easy because it's kind of complicated. While it's trying to do something different, it does kind of always fall back to these generic kind of conventions. But moving on from Raji, there is Palace on the Hill, and this is the story. This is one of those this called cozy games as they're called. So you don't really have to fight, hack and slash or anything. You're like this little. So you see this boy who's kind of who's trying to make some extra money for his family, and he's learning lots of things. He's gone back to his village. He's learning pottery. He's learning how to run a tea shop. He's learning how to interact with people in the village. So almost conducting ethnography in a way. So this is how it is. This is this game, and from there move to another game, which is also quite interesting because this is, I don't know if you will identify with this so much, but I certainly will, and some people here who have grown up in the 80s and the 90s, because we grew up on this in this fair of Soviet books and Soviet magazines like Misha, Sputnik, and all these fantastic translations of Russian stories by Progress publishers and Raduga publishers and others. So this game is called Nobody Knows for Certain. It is by Afra Shafiq, and it is kind of, it creates this web of stories that you read in these Soviet books. So these are the Soviet books from People's Publishing House in the van that you can see. And you have all these narratives connected with Soviet fairy tales, with Soviet kind of journeys into space and so on, and the cat that loses its tail and then finds its way into space and so on. So this is massive kind of a remembering of kind of a time that used to be in India. It was also another notion of India really, which is not just kind of just Indian mythology, but also the complicated idea of India with influences from various different places, and not necessarily always colonial, but from multiple different kind of agencies, and how it is to remember it, how it is to forget it. And then this is another really kind of disturbing game. It's called Missing Game for a Cause. It was made in 2017. It is set in Shonagachi, which is one of the biggest red light areas in this part of the world. And you are playing as a girl who has been kidnapped and being trafficked, and you're trying to escape Shonagachi. And initially, it seems very easy. So you just try to walk out, and then you see that life is not exactly like that. So you are actually part of the system of and then you actually have to, like you see the client here is approaching the girl here, so you have to find kind of different strategies to exit, but also experience trauma. So it's quite a traumatic, and this game was actually made after a lot of research, and there is an artistic, there is kind of this set of art installations called missing silhouettes. Basically, in the streets of Calcutta, you will see randomly on the walls like the silhouette of a girl, and which says that so and so number of girls missing. So this was carried on into this game really. So this is another very well different and kind of disturbing, but also very different kind of game made in India. And then this is another one, which is Forgotten Fields, and it is about an artist. Sorry, it's about a writer who has writer's block, and he can only remember. Sorry, he can only kind of overcome his writer's block when he goes back to his village in Goa, native village in Goa, and just kind of looks at. He basically just does very routine things and goes out into the fields and talks to his friends and experiences nature again. And it's about remembering. It's about trying to remember, basically, which is why it's Forgotten Fields. And then another one, and I'm almost at the end of my list. This is Venba. Venba was basically created by an expat kind of Indian in Canada. And it's about a Canadian family which is forgetting its roots, which is forgetting it's kind of, and it's try they're all three of them are trying desperately to remember their time in India, what they used to be, what they used to do. And how they do it is they find a cookbook by their grandmother, and this cookbook is incomplete. So they try to, again, rebuild the recipes in the cookbook, and that is how they try to remember. So it's basically a cooking game, but then with this idea of memory, this forgetting. So and then finally, this is the Studio Oleomingas's game Somewhere, which I showed you earlier. This part of the game is called the Museum of Dubious Splendors, and it is about kind of basically a group of people who cannot speak, because the moment they speak to someone else, their their thoughts will be subsumed by that other person's thoughts. So basically, they are silent because they're afraid that the interlocutor will invade their thoughts, will colonize their thoughts. So, and this is how kind of you just kind of go through this silent spaces. And so basically, I'll just read this out. So the mechanics of the game show that other people's fictions can infect one's own sense of self. Hopping from character to character functions as more than just disorientation. The player is constantly aware of his intrusion as he invades each body, leaving behind a pervasive and disturbing sense of alienation. The concept capitalizes on the language of fracture particular to games, a language that speaks so readily to the occupation of identities, the fragmentation of narrative. As you can see, there's all of these fragmented kind of images that you encounter when you play this game. So, in a sense, I see that Venba is similar to Forgotten Fields in the way it addresses forgetting and the attempt to reconstruct identities by piecing together incomplete and scattered memories. And both are similar to Oleomingas's games in the fragmentary nature of their narratives. So, all of these last three games I see as having this kind of theme of forgetting, of kind of trying to piece together identities, of scattered and fragmentariness, which are all kind of somewhat, and obviously Oleomingas's game directly connects to postcolonialism, because it is about kind of this scenario where these people they are afraid of speaking to others because the others will infect their thoughts, will colonize their thoughts. And actually, the game is also set in colonial India. So, well, I mean, so I think, therefore, that with all these examples, that Indian kind of video games are kind of making an impact, and they're trying to establish their kind of a positionality whereby they're looking at their own existence as literary. At the same time, they're questioning their own kind of literariness. At the same time, they're also questioning their own Indianness, but they are kind of doing so. They are in this. They're kind of dealing with issues of fragmentariness of identities. They're dealing with issues of forgetting memory, who they are really, or who they represent. And this is also something I addressed later. I mean, I addressed my kind of in the talk that is going to come up, which is that one when I'll talk about can the subaltern play. But right now, I want to also kind of connect this idea of storytelling and the colonial kind, and thinking of about the post-colonial situation. But I want to do this with through Salman Rushdie. And Rushdie, as I said, has now become, well, I'm not sure about now, but when he was writing Joseph Anton, he had really gotten into games, and he was playing Red Dead Redemption, the same game that I showed you in the very beginning. So he says that my 13-year-old boy Milan and his friends all seem to be playing right now this Wild West game called Red Dead Redemption. And one of the things looking over, I mean, I don't even pretend to understand what is going on really, but one of the things that is interesting about it to me is the much looser structure of the game and the much greater agency that the player has to choose how he will explore and inhabit the world provided for you. He doesn't, in fact, doesn't really have to follow the main narrative line of the game at all for long periods of time. There is all kinds of excursions and digressions you can choose to go on and find many stories to participate in instead of the one big story, the macro story. So Rashdi says that I think that really interests me as a storyteller because I've always thought that one of the things that the internet and the gaming world permits as a narrative technique is not to tell the story from beginning to end, but to tell the story sideways, to give alternative possibilities that the reader can then, in a way, choose between. And just when I'm thinking about telling the story sideways and then not telling the story from beginning to end, I'm also then thinking about what stories, whether am I going to actually necessarily have to look at stories from the archive, which are designed in a certain chronological order. We have been reading about sequential narratives earlier, so which have been designed by a certain in a certain sequence by our colonial masters, or can we read sideways as we want, according to multiple different other possibilities, right? As perhaps more, our post-colonial thinkers kind of encourage us to do, really, as perhaps we are encouraged to do when we are reading not in the archive, but perhaps as kind of even kind of in subaltern voices. So I think that's where I will kind of stop for this one. And if you have any kind of thoughts, just let me know, and then we can move on to the next.
Good.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukherjee. That was really crisp. And we'll have questions, comments from the audience, I'm pretty sure. Hopefully, lots of hands will go up.
Fine.
Unless you're all hungover from Sukoon and yes.
Hello, sir. Sir, so while you were ending the presentation, you made the comment of the narrative not being linear and sideways. So I was just wondering, as compared to something like cinema or even a novel that goes in a definite direction, has a certain idea in mind, when video games offer like multiple choices and multiple endings, something like Detroit Become Human, which has multiple like of endings that you can choose from, like a lot. How do you think that impacts the overall integrity of the game, like the direction it's heading in?
I'm right.
I would say that it's already kind of it was always already there in kind of other narrative media as well, right? Because when you are reading a novel, there are all these other reading sideways. I think Rashti is spot on here. Really, there are all these other possibilities that you can look at instead of this one particular. But video games, I think, just make it much more obvious, right? And they also kind of uh, push forward this idea of agency, which I will question in my next kind of talk. But the whole idea of agency itself is quite problematic. But they make it seem that you can make these decisions. But this is already there in earlier media as well. Video games just make it more formally kind of evident, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for the session. The question I want to ask is regarding the point that you argued for, the literariness of video games. So if something is literary, obviously has kind of social relevance or social implication. So considering we are talking in the context of India, Indian writing in English, right? So if something is literary, it has a social implication. So it's a video game, something like a video game and the current literary divide, the digital divide in India. Considering that, I think I personally feel like the source and the destination is kind of predetermined. Who gets the access, the agency, who can produce video games and whom it is destined to reach. So in that sense, how's something like a video game going to, help the marginalized?
So, Emma, thank you for that question. I was expecting it, and a really, really nice question, and thought-provoking one. Think of English. There are people outside this room, or who will not understand what I'm saying when I'm using English as a medium, and this is the criticism that has been leveled against Indian writers in English, right? And which is what I kind of, which is why you invoked Amit Chaudhary, right? But at the same time, there are things, there is some reason why we have Indian writing in English, right? And yes, it is true that it is not there are people who are not being able to access. So as you can see, the comparison with IWE and video games as well. When you talk about access, I use the same comparison. But there is, again, you do talk about digital access. Some people, of course, now there are so many video games which are available on mobile phones, and one can argue that many people have more smartphones than they used to earlier. So you have this access that is happening, so much so that our powers that be, they actually talked about PUBG in pub. So it's kind of so video games then have become quite pervasive, and they are not as limited in access as they used to be, at least in my childhood. But you're right about access. Then the same question also arises with English as well, as a medium to which not everybody has access. But at the same time, when you talk about the literariness of video games, I've already talked about how we're looking at a broader definition of literature, right? Which is not just the written text itself. At one point, even the graphic novel was not called the graphic novel. When I was a child, I was literally prevented from reading Chacha Chaudhary books. I could only read Tintin on a train. That was life then, because comics apparently were bad for my eyes. But now the whole narrative has changed. We're talking about medical humanities and kind of graphic novels. So there is this kind of reconfiguration in thinking, right, of what is literary and what is not. And video games, I think, now are coming under this broad, category of. They were always there, but it's now more obvious. Of course, I have cherry-picked some games which are more kind of in sync with my talk. I'm sure there are many games that you can show, like let's say somebody talking about Pro Evolution Soccer, or a racing or a car racing game, or an absolutely mindless beat 'em up game, which might not have as much kind of literary kind of attraction. But there is this how do I say it? This border between play and story is fuzzy. So, like I said, then you read games and you play books, right? Nevertheless, even when you are playing a game, even in a game of cricket, there is a story, right? And people write those stories. So that's there. So and stories are rule bound as well as so are games. So there are all of these that are there.